Okay? So, we gotta, what does moving towards independence mean, Andy? Let's talk about, where are we right now? Where is the United States right now? What are we doing? Go ahead. What are we right now? 1750, what are we? What is the United States of America? But 13 colonies, right? And we'll get into this, but do we have an overall government? Does every colony follow every single route? No, every colony is kind of their own separate deal, okay? And so we're ruled by who? Who owns us at this point? King George and Great Britain, right? We're under British rule. People have come from all over, right? I mean, they're not only English people in the United States, but by 1763, Great Britain had this enormous empire across the world. Not just the colonies. The colonies was really kind of a small part of it, okay? So by 1763, Great Britain's empire, I mean, it had claims that circled the world. They had a huge amount of possessions in the world. And the American colonies were part of this, okay? And again, like Andy said, they were 13 colonies, different colonies. A lot of them had different rules, different philosophies, different religions. So it wasn't what you'd call a United States of America. We had 13 colonies. But again, I want to emphasize, by 1763, this empire that they had, the American colonies were just a small part of that. Well, if you own land, so to speak, or you have empire all over the world, one of the problems you have is maintaining that. How do you keep track of that? How do you rule it? They had an unbelievable vast claim of land across the world, the British Empire. And they're going to start in 1763 to really encounter some problems in maintaining that worldwide empire. Okay? They've almost got too much. Now, one of the problems that Great Britain is going to face will be these American colonies that's overseas. That's just another problem. They're going to start having trouble maintaining those colonies. So when did when did this start? Anybody know approximately when we started coming over here? I guess, or way before 1763, right? Okay. So I want to point out a guy, and this guy is not on your ID sheet, but you need to write him down. Count Verzen. Spell this correctly for you. A guy by the name of Count Verzen. He was a French official, and he was kind of paying attention to this British Empire across the world, and he was specifically paying attention to the American colonies. And he might have been the first guy that could anticipate, you know what? Great Britain's going to have a very difficult time controlling these American colonies. Okay? They're kind of like teenagers. Mako was a lot better at listening to his mother when he was 5 than he is when he's 15. That's just common. Well, maybe not, but I'm just saying. You know what I mean? So the American colonies have what? As he went from 5 to 15, he did what? He grew up. Well, the American colonies have grown up. Okay? They've got some of their own ideas and their own philosophies. Now, Count Verzen made the comment in like 1763. He said this. And you don't have to write these quotes down unless I tell you to write them down, but you need to listen to get the perspective. So concerning the American colonies, Count Verzen said this in 1763. He said, quote, "The American colonies stand no longer in need of England's protection. England will call on them to contribute towards supporting the burden they have helped to bring on her, and they will answer by striking off all dependence." Okay, I'm going to read that again. I want you to think about it. The American colonies stand no longer in need of England's protection. They've grown up. You don't think your parent needs to protect you as much when you're 16 than they did when you're 6. Okay? England will call on them to contribute towards supporting the burden they have helped to bring on her. What's the burden that England has?
They were in debt because of
Where they were in debt, and they were going to need financial assistance to control this empire. And what he's saying is, Number one, the American colonies don't feel like they need Britain's protection anymore. We've grown up. England's going to call on the American colonies to help contribute to the burden that they, the American colonies, have also put on England by being one of their possessions. Does that make sense? And his point is, and they will answer by striking off all dependents. If you're striking off all dependents, you are eventually going to declare your independence. He predicted that in 1763. French diplomat by the name of Count Verzen said in 1763, hey, we got a problem here. These American colonies are thinking they don't need England as much as they used to for protection. England's going to ask them to contribute to this huge burden that the British Empire has established by making this worldwide empire, and the American colonies are part of that burden, and they're going to ask them to pay their way. And the American colonies are going to strike off all dependence or become more independent of Great Britain. How are they going to ask them to help them with the burden? Taxes. We'll get into that later. So does everybody kind of understand that? 13 years later, the British colonies in America declared their independence from Great Britain. He predicted this 13 years before it happened. So 13 years after Count Verzen made the prediction that America would eventually declare their independence for the reasons I gave you, they did. 13 years later. That's pretty good insight. And it was a Frenchman that figured that out. So that's a little bit of information I give you before we move to the first subtopic. Any questions on that? So where we're at is the American colonies are starting to believe that they can handle things on their own. And pretty soon Britain's going to start asking them to help with some of this burden. They're not going to want to do it. Okay? And we'll see what happens. Okay? So the first subtopic then is problems faced by the British in governing their empire. Problems faced by the British in governing their empire. And again, keep in mind, kiddos, that they have a huge empire all across the world, and the American colonies are just one small part of that. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to break down 4 major problems that Great Britain had in trying to deal with governing this great, big, vast empire. Okay? 4 major problems they had in trying to govern this vast empire. Okay? I would make it, I try to give all examples that maybe make sense. It's just like if I live in Worland, Wyoming, and I got a rental property in Bozeman, Montana, and I got a rental property in Jackson, Wyoming, and I got a rental property in Phoenix, Arizona, and I got a rental property in Seattle, Washington, and I got a rental property in New York City, and I'm living in Worland. How do I maintain my empire? How do I make sure that the people living in my house in New York are doing the right thing, and how do I make sure that, it's a tough deal, okay? And pretty soon it's going to cost me money to go here, 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 and here to check all this out. And so who am I going to put that burden on? My renters, right? Your rent's going to have to go up a little bit because I got to fly all the way to New York to make sure you're taking care of my property. Does that make sense? That's kind of what they're doing. But here are the 4 problems that Great Britain had in trying to deal in governing this vast empire that was all around the world. And again, emphasizing that the American colonies were just a small part of it. Number 1, first problem, weakness of British leaders. Weakness of British leaders. By 1763, when Count Verzen made this prediction, it was very evident that British leadership was very ineffective in England. They had poor leaders running the country. The people that were leading Britain at the time didn't have any quality, broad education. They were not very well educated. They did not have a quality, broad education. They did not have a quality, broad education. And here she comes to save the day. How you doing?
I'm good.
We started a little lecture here. You might have to get on the old website to pick up this first part, okay?
Okay.
You'll need this yellow sheet in front of you, okay? They also lack the ability to find solutions. Okay, that's not a good trait to have as a leader. They lacked the ability to find solutions. Where did they have to find solutions? What two areas? Specific to us, they had to find solutions to problems where? What's that where though? Consider in the colonies. Okay, they couldn't find solutions to satisfy the needs of the colonies. They couldn't even find solutions to satisfy the needs of their own country, let alone everything they were trying to govern. The king at the time was King George III, who is on your ID sheet. It would be good to just give him a little highlight. King George III. And he served England from 1760 to 1820. Okay? He served England from 1760 to 1820. So think about that. When was the Revolutionary War, kiddos? Yeah, so he served well. He was an ineffective leader, and he served well before the Revolutionary War and well after. Okay, he was a problem. So King George III was king from 1760 to 1820. He was not only ineffective, he was very stubborn. A bad combination, frankly, if you're going to be a leader. Okay, a bad combination if you're going to be a leader. Now, what does the President of the United States surround himself with to help him govern the United States? Advisors, very good. They called them ministers, which I believe is on your ID sheet as well. They called those ministers in that day. So King George III was surrounded by a lot of ministers or aides, as you mentioned. But they really weren't very good. So if Miss Caballero is going to be an aide to me, what do I really need from her to be effective? What do I need her? I mean, obviously, she's going to have to be loyal. I wouldn't have her if she wasn't loyal. I don't want to have somebody that's an aide to me that is not loyal. So she's loyal. But what can be the problem with loyalty? If I pick you as my aide, you're going to be my advisor in this class, and I all of a sudden, without really saying much to you, or maybe I say it to you, say, you know, I tell you what, starting tomorrow, everybody in here is going to have to wear a pink shirt for the rest of the year. Now, what's your opinion on that, really? If I said you guys, all you guys got to wear pink shirts to start the rest of the year. If you don't wear a pink shirt the rest of the year, every day you're going to get an F. What would you think, personally? Yeah, but a good aide would say to me, Mr. Drew, that's really not, and I can say like Mr. Smith and I, or Mr. Sanford and I get along very well. So if Mr. Sanford would do something I think might not be that great, I would say, gee, I don't know about that, but whose decision would it be in the end? His. So, but she thinks that this pink shirt thing's kind of stupid, right? Well, she's got two choices. What's her two choices? Well, she got three choices. She could ignore it, or what's your other two choices? Or say you're not stupid, right? Well, the problem with King George III's ministers is they were much more worried about pleasing him than they were actually giving him any good advice. And that's not good. You're not a very good leader, okay? And so King George III was surrounded by ministers or advisors or aides that were only concerned about pleasing him as the king, not what was best for the country. So let's look at this. So you got leaders in Parliament. Now, Parliament's, if you don't know that, Parliament's like the American Congress, okay? If you got leaders in Parliament that are not very well educated, they can't find solutions to their own country, let alone the United States colonies. Well, I shouldn't say United States, I gotta say American colonies or their empire. That's bad. Then you got a king who rules a long period of time, who's very ineffective, and I don't think I mentioned this, but he was also very, very stubborn. And then he was surrounded by ministers or aides or advisors who were much more interested in pleasing him as king than giving him any good advice. So if it was up to, if I was King George III and Alexa was my advisor, you'd all be wearing pink shirts to school tomorrow, because that's what would have happened. See, so that's not good. So there's the first problem that Great Britain had in dealing with their vast empire, is they had a weakness of leadership. Okay? Second problem is they had a big need for new taxes. They had a big need for new taxes. So they're going to have trouble governing their empire because they're going to need new taxes. Now, Sully was right on the ball here, and I kind of brushed her because we're getting to it here. And here's an example of the need for new taxes. There were two reasons why they needed to get tax revenue. One, Sully mentioned part of it, between 1689 and 1763. Between 1689 and 1763, including the 100 Years' War, they fought 4 wars during that period of time. So between 1689 and 1763, Great Britain fought 4 wars, including the 100 Years' War that Sully mentioned. What happens when you fight wars? You go in debt, big time. So they were heavily in debt. Now, they also fought a war called the French and Indian War, which was in the Americas. That war alone cost nearly $22 billion in today's currency. Not that current, but today's. I mean, so they were heavily in debt. That's the first need for taxes, is they had fought 4 wars between 1689 and 1763, and the French and Indian War alone cost Great Britain nearly $22 billion in today's currency. Okay? The second reason why they needed money or new taxes is because, kind of what I mentioned before, when they built this huge empire across the world, what's your biggest fear when you have land a long ways away? That's right, very good. Their fear of it was going to get taken, so because of their worldwide conquest, they needed money to maintain their military so they could defend this empire that they had built across the world. So they had to build up their military. So they need money because they're heavily in debt, and they still need more money to build up this military to defend all their possessions across the world. Where's that money going to come? Where are those taxes going to come from? The people involved in their empire, including the American colonies. And the American colonies have gotten to the point where they think that they've about had enough of Great Britain's protection. So we'll see how that goes later when they start asking. Okay, the third reason why Great Britain had trouble with their empire was the future of Florida and Canada. The future of Florida and Canada. Anybody know how we got Florida and Canada? How did we acquire those? Anybody know? We didn't have, I shouldn't say we, British. How'd they get Florida and Canada?
Is it from Spain?
Yep. And who else? French. Okay, how did we win those? In which war? French and Indian War. Okay, so the Great Britain had Florida and Canada. They were lands that they acquired as a result of the French and Indian War. So what are they going to have to do, the governments of Florida and Canada that were Spanish and French? Yeah, reorganize them to British rule. Well, do you think that those French and Spanish people that were living in both Canada and Florida, by the way, the Spanish and the French have been long-time enemies to this point of the British, like forever. Do you think the people living in those two areas that have been conquered are very interested in having a government of British choosing? No. So, they're British subjects now by virtue of their loss in the French and Indian War, and these two groups of people, the French and the Spanish, were very, very hard to govern. So that was another problem they had. Was that what do we do with the future of Canada and Florida? Here we've conquered these two areas, we've received them as a virtue of our victory in the French and Indian War. Neither the French or the Spanish have any interest whatsoever of being governed. So is Sweden allies with Russia? No. So if Russia came in and took Sweden and wanted to make you a Russian, how would you like that?
I mean, couldn't that do very much because Russia has more power than we have?
I know, but would you be? Yeah, would you be happy about it?
No.
So if they said now you got to speak Russian and do everything Russian, would you say okay?
No.
Yeah. See. So there you go. Same thing. Okay. Same thing. Foreign perspective. Thank you very much, Julie. The fourth and final reason that Britain was going to have a hard time governing their vast empire were the Western lands. The Western lands. Anybody know where the western lands are? I got, gee whiz, I'm gonna have to find a new place to hang my t-shirts.
Isn't it basically anything west of where the colonies were at?
Close, and what was kind of a major border of that? What was right here that separated Appalachian Mountains? Right, there's a reason you guys are in here. So the western lands were basically all the lands west of the colonies or west of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay? So another area that the British government was forced to deal with would be the western lands, and again, that's the vast area that was acquired when the British defeated the French in the lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Who lives over there? Native Americans, specifically the Ottawa, O-T-T-A-W-A Indian tribes. A-T-T-A-W-A, Ottawa Indian tribes. Were still living in the western lands, and they didn't like the way the British were treating them after the French and Indian War. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of why the Ottawa Indians were upset with the British and how they were being treated after the French and Indian War. Well, prior to the French and Indian War, the Ottawa Indians were trading with who? Spanish, and the British to a point. But when the British took them over, all of a sudden they started charging them much higher prices when trading with the tribes. They upped the ante because they could, because they had control. So the first thing the Ottawa Indians were upset about, they were concerned over the high prices that Great Britain was asking when trading with the tribes. They jacked the prices up after they gained control. Well, the second thing that upset the Ottawa Indians is that they had been accumulating rifles over time. We'll have a unit on the Native Americans. I think it's a great unit later. Talk about how Native Americans went from bow and arrow to ammunition, Custer